All right, well, it looks like we're ready to get started. We've got a good number of people in the room, around 17 people, I think, online. So I wish you all good and Pacific greetings. My name is Soli. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Adelaide and what's called a visiting research collaborator here at ANU, School of Cultural History and friends to be here. So it's a great honour to be here today to share this interesting discussion on the complex topics of positionality and relationality. So given the nature of the topic, I guess it would be remiss of me to say that I'm an eighth generation settler Australian. He spent the last 20 years living and working in the Pacific, but I was actually born here on beautiful warm and big country. So I'm feeling very connected to country today. I've just been I've been cuddling a wombat for the last hour, and I'm not sure if anyone in the room, one of mine saw a beautiful sunrise this morning. It was pink and glorious. So it's also a great one to acknowledge that we are meeting the traditional lands of the Malungahu and Massey people, and to pay all of our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, who have been in the country for over 20,000 years. Usually in the Pacific, we would start our meetings with a word of prayer or a blessing. Sometimes we would ask for forgiveness for anything that we would say that might offend each other during our discussions. But I thought it might be nice just to start our meeting by centering a bit on Gemma. So for anyone who's attended Welcome to Country from Nambi Elder Hall House, you'll probably be familiar with that word. Inquirer is the Louey word for respect, but it's a form of respect that asks us to go gently, to go with honour, to take responsibility, to meet each other from a place of love. So I think it's a good way perhaps to start this discussion and a nice way to honour the traditional customs of this land. So today's session has come about because of these four brave, intelligent women. I think it started with two research fellows, Gemma and Judy, who invited doctoral students, Akka and Putt, into the discussion. If you come for answers, you come to run a seminar. But if you come to listen to their reflections, if you come to have a conversation, if you come to challenge each other, and perhaps be part of an ongoing process, perhaps in writing and more discussion, then you're definitely in the right place. We are recording today, but the panel has decided that the recording will only be more public if everybody's comfortable with that. So our priority is that everybody can speak freely, including all of you online and in the room, but just to let you understand the recording. So just briefly to set the scene, we're here today to reflect on researchers' positionality, on our social, cultural and political position within a particular context, and how our background, our experience, our identities, as well as our relationality to each other, to place, and shape our perspectives, our biases, and ultimately the knowledge we produce. So our panellists all share interest and history in conducting research in the Pacific region, including Australia. They will bring their own unique perspectives and experiences to bear in their work and for our discussion today. So this seminar is an opportunity to explore and consider the meaning and understanding of positionality and relationality, and to reflect a bit on the challenging nature of fostering and undertaking ethical and considered research. So I'll now hand over to my panel. I haven't introduced them fully, you've probably read their bios, but as they're speaking on positionality and relationality, I'll leave that to them. They'll all share their reflections for probably about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time to open back up for conversation and unpacking some of the issues that come with their reflections and their experiences. So Gemma, I believe we're starting with you.
Malo pito, kimoi ke whai haki itala noa o ku mahoinga o pito ke o tomatu ke whawhetai mo whakamalo ke tō taha I otua. I hene tau I tau mo ui vai tawa usia ai aho whakakolo ko emi I wish I was there in person, but I've had some really important family matters to tend to here in Sydney. So I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal peoples from whose lands I am zooming in from, where land and sovereignty of First Nation peoples was never ceded. I am the eldest daughter of Galepi Malungahu, who is from Golonga, a village northeast coast of Tangatapu in the Hahake district within the Kingdom of Tonga, the only remaining monarchy in the Pacific. My mother, Soli Malungahu, is from one of the 4 outer islands within Tonga, within Ha'apai, from a village called Tungua. My maternal great-grandmother, Sinalauli, is Samoan, so I'd like to acknowledge also my Samoan heritage. I was born and raised within South Auckland, in particular Mangere and Otara, within New Zealand, and I had recently migrated to Australia in 2019 following my parents who had migrated earlier with family back in 2011. So in terms of the topic of discussion today, it wasn't until higher degree research that I really started to think about positionality and what that actually means. And as a peoples or as specific peoples, we might not know who we are and where we come from in terms of our identity as individuals, but also as a collective. But it isn't until we actually sit down and really reflect on, writing about positionality and our identity, that we really go through this process of reflexivity and reflecting on our position. And for me, when I had written about that section in my PhD thesis, it really made me dig deep into inwardly looking into myself, right? But also looking outwards at the same time. And a lot of that inward, obviously, because you're reflecting on your upbringing, your journey from childhood to date, and outward because of the important people and relationships that have influenced your life. The accumulated experiences over time and space and place, and your views of the world around you and your place in it. And to me, that's what positionality and relationality is really about. It's about reflecting on your own worldview, and the influence of your experiences, of course, can be related to an array of intersecting factors, such as your lineage, your ancestry, social class, gender, ethnicity, nationality, and so forth. But at times it can be challenging because you're tasked with, okay, how much do I share? How much is too much? And what is enough to warrant meeting this task of sharing your positionality within research? And of course, essentially, it's up to the researcher about, what you're willing to share with regards to your positionality. But in spite of this, reflexivity provides us with a sense of accountability, of recognizing and understanding or addressing the worldview that we go into the research process with, and being aware of how that might inform or influence how the research is framed, the questions that we might ask or omit, the interpretation of the literature and the findings, and also what we choose to present and document and what we ought to leave out. So sometimes the process of reflexivity can be one of interrogation, where we are unpacking and uncovering some of the implicit biases that we might have, or the subconscious perceptions that we might have related to the topic or related to people or groups, which at times can be uncomfortable, but I feel that it's very necessary to grow, not only as a researcher, but also as a person. And so if we don't do that, obviously it can influence the way that we interact with others, the way that we interact with our research team, the way we interact with data, the way we interpret it, and so forth. And obviously extends beyond the research realm to be inclusive of everyday life. And one example I have that I'm willing to share is when I got held up about my own worldview, where I was confronted by a mentor, but also a friend who asked Gemma, you know, whenever we have a writing retreat, you always ask, are there any other Tongans attending? And that caught me off guard. So I just laughed. I laughed it off. And when I reflected on it, not only did it teach me about myself, about how Tongan-centric my worldview is, which makes sense because of my positionality and how I was raised, but it also meant that it was kind of limiting in the way of what I thought was important, and therefore chose to prioritize when learning and researching about the Pacific. And it was also me depriving myself of an opportunity to learn about peoples and cultures outside of my worldview. And so there's a lot of growth and continual reflexivity of our positionality, not only in terms of research, but also how we can become better people in general. So that's enough for me. I'll pass it on to my fellow panelists, Marlo.
I don't want to give my back to the online audience, but it's important to make the interaction with the audience in the room as well. Gemma, thank you so much for setting the context today at the discussion. I think it's an extremely important discussion, and I want to thank DPA for bringing this up. Now, asking myself, how do I view both positionality and relationality? As the word depicts, positionality is to position yourself and understand where you stand in terms of your bias, and the bias would be things that are fixed, culturally ascribed. So it could be what Gemma was talking about, my identity, my privilege as an educated woman, identity as a Pacific Islander, said that earlier, and my viewpoint, my epistemology, ontology on the subject that I'm covering, but also on everything else that's connected to it. It's extremely important to me because of what Gemma stressed, the need to understand your own identity, right? But for me, I think it's about asking this very important question in research. And the question is, why are you doing this? So I'm doing research in climate change. Yes, it's important. It's a pressing issue in the world today. But why are you doing it, Akka? So if you can't answer that question, I don't think you have value added. That's positionality. So to be able to position myself between that bias and the social and political context that shape the subject that I'm undertaking is extremely important. And then for me, I would be able to leverage, okay, I understand where I stand, where the balance is. And then you have relationality on the other hand. And for me, it is an intrinsic part of my work as a scholar, because relationality talks about relations. And when I hear the word relations, it really means trust, mutual respect, relationships, and that's something that's extremely important. I also like to see it in view of a means to an end. I'm doing something because I want to get somewhere. First, I started with the question, why am I doing this? And then second is, but where are you headed? What do you want to do? What do you want to impact? Okay, fine, you want to change the world, but how do you want to do that? I think these are extremely important details. So my positionality and relationality perspective, and I want to appreciate that there is no right and wrong answer in this space, but for me, it's intrinsic to my work. It's extremely important. As I said earlier, understanding both and being able to sort of, I guess, strike the balance and embrace both worlds. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how my work in development and as a researcher sort of made me look at these two things differently. But it's extremely important and it adds value to my work. And I'll end there, but maybe because Gemma also started off by introducing myself, and this is a positionality panel. Everyone in the room knows me, but for the sake of the audience who's tuning in, I'm Akka, Rimon from Kiribati. I've worked in Kiribati for 13 years. I'm young, not old, and don't you laugh? Anyway, and so yes, I'm very fortunate to be able to have this opportunity to pursue my positionality and my relationality to a subject that matters massively to me on climate change and security. I'll end there and I'll look forward to the next portions of the discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Akka. Hi everyone, so my name is Louey. I'm a rat bag, southern-minded daughter of a Chinese father and a white settler Australian mother. Grew up in the country town, coastal country town of Macquarie, which is about 4 hours north of Sydney, and then moved into Sydney for, I suppose, the high school, tertiary education. And my kind of pathway into research in the Pacific was kind of facilitated through some wonderful mentors who I still to this day am absolutely awe of. And it's kind of always followed this journey around environmental justice. That's kind of how I've come into it. And wanting, first being shocked by and then wanting to learn more about how Australia and I suppose kind of external nations to the Pacific, some of the ways in which we have come in and perpetuated some really horrific harms and trying to hold ourselves accountable to that. So yeah, this really humbling to be on this panel. I think when this was first proposed in the workshop, I was really excited to just sit and listen. And so it's a bit funny to be up here talking. And so I suppose the contribution I'm hoping to make today is just to really talk through some of the processes of my reflection and grappling around positionality and relationality, far from any kind of answers or strong insights, but yeah, just to share kind of how I've approached the matter and you know, some of the challenges that have come along the way as well. So in terms of my thinking around positionality, I'm a millennial, and so I feel like it's sort of a pastime for my generation to be doing this reflection on positionality. So I've been doing a bit of thinking around this before the PhD. But that's not to say that this thinking is not still very much an ongoing thing, something that I'm still grappling with. But yeah, it was kind of something that started a little bit beforehand. Also, as a woman of colour, it's definitely plays a lot on my mind as well, and recognising the way that I interact through spaces is different, not only depending on my own positionality, but also the way that people read me. I know that I interact in spaces and important interactions in spaces depending on how people read who I am too. And so that's been something that I've been aware of before the PhD, but I've definitely continued on that journey while I've been here. On the side of relationality, that's been something that's been a lot newer, I think, and has been picked up through the PhD process. So yeah, I think it's been through the guidance of some wonderful mentors and friends and role models who really encouraged me to think about the way that I sit in connection, and my research sits in connection to other ideas, to people, to communities, to places, and to really reflect on, I suppose for me, principles of care and also responsibility. And that kind of sits at the heart of how I approach relationality and some of my stuff. In terms of questions that I found really helpful to ask myself, again, I'm very much on a journey and probably still very much front loaded at the beginning of that journey too. But some questions that I found really helpful to ask myself along the way. I was pushed by a role model a few years ago to ask him, why am I doing this research? I think that can be really challenging. Obviously, interest is a big part of it, but for those of us particularly who aren't from the communities that we're working with, we really need to think about, you know, why are we engaging in this stuff? How can we be helpful? Because we know that research and academia has caused a lot of harm. And so we kind of need to be really thoughtful about why actually we want to do this research. Yeah, so that's a really key one. The second question is also, who is this research for? This is kind of really where the relationality stuff for me comes to front and centre. It's been really playing on my mind over the last couple of months. I'm at the point, as many of you know, of kind of writing up and doing kind of sift through some of the insights that have come from wonderful interviews and research so far, and moving to the point of writing up a PhD. But because a lot of my research circulates around kind of questions of power, and it's kind of doing a critical analysis in the sense of kind of trying to unpack some of that, it means that some of the insights and some of the arguments also can have a critical element to it. And so how do I hold with care the relationships that have allowed me to kind of build some of my research and if I'm kind of like playing on my mind of questions, if I'm too critical, would that risk, harming and compromising relationships? But if I'm not critical enough, then what is this research for? What's the purpose of it? And so trying to find that balance, very much still grappling with it, but keeping in mind that question of who is this research for has been helpful for me to try and tread a path of how I'm actually going to shape actually kind of the simple kind of output of the research. And the final question is also reflecting on what are my limits as a researcher. That applies both to, what actually are my skills and what can I bring to the table, but then obviously questions around access. I think that's probably the most important thing. Gemma touched on it earlier. There are lots of debates around, am I, and you can apply this to all different people, but am I the right person doing this kind of research? How do I approach it? How do I negotiate access to knowledge as well? Because it's always a negotiation. I think by this point we know that there are many knowledges that are closed for very good reasons. So recognising how to work the limits for me as a researcher. So off those questions, what's been really helpful for me, I've had some really wonderful people in my life who have allowed me to hold conversations with them that kind of allow me to keep talking to them about my evolving thinking. And to be vulnerable, to have those messy spaces, and they've been trusted friends that have also then pulled me up when I've gone astray. And I value that so much, to have those spaces where you can actually talk it through with other people, because I know that positionality and relationality, they're often quite reflective exercises. You're thinking on your own person, or you're kind of the only person who can really interrogate yourself. But I think there's a lot of value in actually being able to talk about these things as communities. And so I found it really valuable to have friends and mentors that I can kind of talk these things through in safe spaces. That's also to say that not every space needs to be a space of this kind of open reflection and divulgence. Again, as a millennial, I know that my generation is also very prone to kind of performativity and very prone to just letting kind of overburdening other people with our own issues. And so not every space is always a space of this reflection. So we need to be mindful of that too. And so just those 3 final learnings that I kind of picked up along the way. It's really hard, but really important work. So one is that sometimes we just need to sit in the discomfort of it. These are lifelong journeys that we're going along. And I think if you reach the point of comfort, you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough. And because we're not always going to be getting it right, trying to find some of those communities around you that can support you and hold you, and you can do the same back to them as well, that reciprocity, I found really valuable. It's certainly been something that's helped me kind of along the way.
I'm of a much earlier generation. Taking time to be performative. It's always been a struggle throughout my life to be publicly speaking and talking about oneself. I come from an Anglo-Australian tradition, which means you don't really talk about yourself or what is significant to you, especially your emotions and significant people too. However, I do think in terms of positionality and relationality, I will say a little. I was born in Scotland. We moved to Australia when I was 8. Like I'm an Anglo-Australian. I have 4 significant relatives who I know really well, but that's my sole sort of kinship network. I therefore have travelled lightly through the world in terms of social connections, forged usually through groups of interest and friendships, rather than being able to draw on connection, place, kinship networks. So that's kind of, I'm very mindful of that in the way I travel through the world. I think in terms of my own positionality and relationality, in many respects, what has influenced me has more been the reading I did, in particular when I was 16 years of age, when I read Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, The Club of Rome report on the limits of growth, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, Germaine Greer's Unique, and The Women's Room by Marilyn French. And from that point onwards, the way I've seen the world is in terms of a feminist standpoint. It is an acute awareness of how we are destroying our planet, and it is informed by a sense of structural injustice, and in particular class. because that is nuanced by my own family background, which is a working class tradition within the English heritage. My grandfathers fought in wars as lowly soldiers. My grandmother was a maid in a rich person's house. So it's both personal but also informed by the kind of reading I did as a young woman, but it has carried through. So it's a framing of positionality and relationality through experience, as Gemma said, but I also think the ideas that you encounter and how they can shape you as well. More specifically, in terms of research, I did my PhD more than 20 years ago, and at that time, people didn't really embrace the idea of a positionality statement. But because my PhD was done within anthropology, there was a lot of thinking, discussion, of an argument about those very questions that Akka and Pip mentioned, that why are we doing what we're doing, who should do it, and a consideration of the differences in power that may be embodied within the research process and embodied in you as a member of academia, either as a student or more recently for me as a staff member. So it's not as if it wasn't being canvassed, it's just the way it is represented. There's no real difference between now. I actually prepared a page of thoughts on research collaboration because I wanted to talk about the years that I've been doing research more from a collaborative point of view. As a PhD student, I was a single researcher doing under 2 years of field work in a place that Suzanne's very familiar with in Western Australia. And well, in total, actually, it's 5 years living in that particular place. But since then, and before that, actually, all the research I have ever done has been collaborative, both in the sense of working with fellow researchers, but also how you work with the other participants in that research process. I don't feel that I will read out what I prepared on that research collaboration, but maybe that's something that can be explored again at a future date. And in particular, I wanted to anchor that discussion based on an article I recently read called Love Shouldn't Hurt, which is an article about co-designing a theory of change to prevent violence against women in Samoa. And there are 11 authors listed for that journal article. And they describe some of the challenges they had in terms of conducting the research and some of the fracture lines that existed between the researchers and the villages that they were doing the research with. The researchers framed themselves as all being feminists. Some of them were practitioners, some of them were academics. So there was different hierarchies of power that existed within the social landscape in which this research was conducted within, and some of the research team members had more familiarity but understanding and knowledge that was respected within that context. But when it came to writing up the research, of course, guess who was the first author for this journal article? The British academic from the University College of London. So as they moved away out of the field and in terms of the analysis and writing up, a smaller and smaller number of those 11 named authors of the article were less involved. It's a smaller and smaller group. But it's acknowledging that within the social landscape of the actual research, that very different world to which we're operating in right this moment, the actual academic component of the research team, those members of the team would not have had much power. They would very much be probably marginalised in all sorts of ways, possibly, I don't know. But they were very dependent on intermediaries who had that knowledge and power within that local context. It was only outside of that particular environment and the very peculiar world that is academia and the things that we value within academia and these artefacts that we create, these journal articles, that the academic from Britain became the first author. So I think it's enough.
So we are here for a conversation, so I think before asking further questions myself, perhaps we'll ask our online audience and our group here today in Gemma. If anyone has reflections they are also able or willing to share, we really appreciate that. But if you have any reflections of your own or on anything you've heard today, sort of welcome your comments and questions.
Maybe just maybe just picking up on Judy's last comment about that British researcher. I wondered about people's thoughts and reflections on how the university structure is still, incentivizes academics to, be like first authors and produce publications and so forth, and sort of reflect on what that means in terms of, working in the Pacific type environment, and the fact that, a lot of research is often, especially in Melanesia, where I mainly work, it's often about, capacity building connections, ensuring that research outputs are freely available and easy to access. It just seems to me that there's some hypocrisy, contradiction in terms of the incentives that like universities give their researchers, and then also the sort of taking account, perspectives and learning and sharing knowledge in the Pacific where we work.
It's a great question. Maybe we'll head to our staff first to reflect on people who've been in the institution for longest. Anyone wants to comment?
Gemma, do you want to go first?
That's such a great question, Colin. Thank you. And thank you, Judy, for throwing me the question first. I was thinking of this as you were asking the question, and within academia, we are notorious for celebrating success based on, how many research outputs, how many journal articles, how many book chapters or reviews that you could do. And, it adds to this metrics of helping one get promoted and so forth. And so obviously, yeah, you're right. There is a disalignment or an unalignment with what's perceived as important within our Indigenous communities and what's perceived as important within academia, which is very much so a Western institution. And this is something that I've always thought about, and it occurred to me during PRC when we're talking about how the two can be married, or how the two could work in alignment or work in sync. And not necessarily in sync, but, try to work together for the benefit of communities, but also of particularly Indigenous Pacific scholars who need, or not need, but who aspire to building up research outputs for the purpose of, could be something like a hidden agenda, but of course it's about getting Indigenous knowledge systems and processes and practices out there within the academic world. So I think, if anything, going back to what Putt had talked about questioning who then are we benefiting, or who's benefiting from this research. And that was a good example you had given, Judy, about how, the British scholar from London, the School of London, whatever it is, had benefited more so from that rather than marginalised groups in which the research was based on. So I think it's a really difficult, it's something that we should continue to ponder on as researchers, and it's something that the institution must address. Where we are also looking at not only written forms of outputs, but also looking at other impacts within society, the social impacts that research can have as well, more so than just focusing on how many journal articles we can publish. So sometimes there is a balance, there's a fine line there, particularly if a person is an Indigenous scholar, and it can the balance of not just the time that we put into research and, publishing and stuff, but also the time of spending time with the community, actually being embedded and taking part, contributing, giving back. It can be a hard thing to follow when you live in multiple worlds, trying to be a good academic within the academic institution, but at the same time serving the community and making sure that we're taking part in these very important initiatives and development aspects within the region. So it can be draining for Indigenous scholars. It can be very draining. And I think the academic institution needs to do better in terms of understanding how that can take a toll on Pacific scholars predominantly, where they have to share a lot of their time. And, not only are we doing that, but we're also continually reflecting. We're continually trying to establish and maintain these relationships that we're having, not only with our peers in our colleges, but also with the communities that we're doing research with as well. So yeah, it's a hard balance to maintain, but it's a necessary one that the institution must be aware of, and they probably are, but I think more needs to be done about it. Yeah.
I was very influenced by the Comoros when they wrote about the colonisation of consciousness. And I'm always mindful of the fact that anyone who's been part of the university, we are all in our own way kind of wedded to certain traditions of knowledge and how we assess that knowledge. And I in a way don't want to let go of that, if I'm honest, because I do think there's value in some of the key architecture that sits behind this institution that the ANU represents, that kind of knowledge. And I want to be honest about that, I suppose. But more specifically around this point of, the order of authorship, but also the value of journal articles. I think the value of reading this particular article I wanted to talk about was it highlights that for the villagers who were very integral to this research project, I don't think they would really value a journal article. So it's coming back to that question of benefits that Gemma was talking about, trying to think of other ways of communicating or representing that research is really important. And I think it is good to see that there's a bigger array of, I hate the term, but research outputs that are now recognised by academia. Not as much as I'd like to see, but there is an increasing recognition that it's not just journal articles and books and book chapters. I think the ANU is probably a bit slow than some other institutions around there, but it's trying to broaden the scope of what can be taken into account, as can looking more at the impact of your research is getting a lot more of attention nowadays, and the manner in which you engage with others through your research. So there is some really, I think, quite positive changes, but I think we have to still accept that if this institution is to continue as it is, are there elements of that we embrace and accept and see as valuable in and of themselves? We can advocate for some change, which to me is about broadening the scope of what we do, in terms of acknowledgement of that broadening of the scope, but not necessarily thinking that we're going to completely overturn the way academia operates, and why would we? I've just got old and non-revolutionary. But anyway.
Wonder, Akka, if you reflect on that as, as you said earlier, someone who's come to academia from, a space where you see, extreme level of extractive practice, the development sector of consultants coming in, earning lots of money, coming out with information never to return. How do you see the institutions and where they're at, because in that context of your history?
Thank you. I was waiting for you to ask that, but look, I think it's an extremely important dynamic when it comes to scholarship. I'm trying to. I think the way I look at it is researchers coming in, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be very candid with my experience as a practitioner in government and having flyers announced of all these consultants who started off from university. They wrote a paper, they were given a contract to come and do a project because of the work that they pursued in a subject. So I'll just give a bit of a background on how this works in the Pacific, in Kiribati. They come in, report on the things that we already know, and these are issues, these are the challenges that we know exist in our country. So they're reported back to us. And so when I was Secretary of Foreign Affairs, I get really annoyed by this because we know what our issues are. And you wrote a paper and a journal article that tells us everything about these issues and come back and tell us. And so the way I respond to it is tell them, you know, we all know these issues, but do you have a solution for them? Because if you don't, then we'll wait until you have a solution and you come back and help us move to the next step. But I think the important thing that I want to build the discussion around is what Gemma said about, you know, that balance. I think we need to embrace both. There are bits that we need from academia that we also would value at the development end. But I keep saying this to Soli, you know, Soli, we've been at the receiving end for far too long. And we look at the broader things like aid. We started off with aid and donors and it didn't work. And they changed the name to development partnership or development support because it gave us a sense of developing together with the partner. But why are we more dependent? And I want to throw this back to relationality because I think once we get this right with relationality, I think everything else will be ticked. And I think Colin raised a very important point. But as I said earlier, we appreciate that these are the strengths of this research work, but how do we also not just become perpetrators of power and influence? Because in that sort of environment, we sit with locals, take all the information that we can, and here I am. I'll be doing this in a few weeks' time, right? Interviews on a mission with the fieldwork assignment. But my point is, in that sort of an exchange relationship where we come in and speak to, say, people in the Pacific and ask them all that question, we often forget that we are perpetrators of power ourselves. And we come with a clear ethic, we cover our backs with everything that we would not get into trouble with. But what of the other end? What of the people, the participants who we're speaking to? So we up and leave and have everything that we need in the study. But what do we leave for them? And of course, you know, I appreciate that we can't have the answers for everything, and research is important. But I think with the growth of Pacific scholars also, I really resonate strongly to the fact that these are our own Pacific people telling our stories in our own Pacific way. I think Gemma said the importance of oral knowledge. Where we come from in the Pacific, we don't record things. We're not very good at writing, but we're good dancers, we're good singers. Everything is stored in music, folklore music and stories. But how do we strike the balance between that? Why should I have to go by the Western way? And I guess these are the struggles, right? And I understand, I appreciate, because now I'm reminded again, and I think that's right, because I think the tension points are, I'm going to have a conflict of interest with the people that I become too close with. How is that going to influence my results and my work? So there are benefits on both sides. I think we need to learn from both worlds, but I'm also very optimistic that I can still be a scholar as an Kiribati woman pursuing my research in an area that I'm passionate about and still meet the requirements in the Western academia world. I think there is always room for us to integrate. So yeah, I mean, looking at that, going back to the discussion about, how do you make impact? I think we shouldn't forget, I mean, even if you can't promise any benefit to the people that you've taken time of their schedule to sit down and talk to and take all the knowledge. I get really annoyed when I was in Kiribati because this is what we do and nothing is ever solved. We go back and there's a report after report after report on how to address drought in Kiribati. Have we fixed the problem up until now? No. And so I get really angry when it comes to that. And now I'm in academia and I'm saying, okay, you need to slow down, girl, because not everything you bring from your development practitioner world is going to survive here. One of my PhD colleagues told me, Akka, you think your novel ideas, you want to come in and change the way that they do things in academia? Good luck. And I say, but why can't we make noise and bang the doors and say, please, this is how I want to do it, a specific way. Because only then I feel that we can blend and integrate.
Thank you, Akka. No, it's very important that we keep doing that. Does anyone have anything they want to add to this discussion before I head to Chope's question? And got people online, apologies, that was a question from Colin Wiltshire. If you do ask a question, please introduce yourself. Chope, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, just thank you, first of all, to the panel and to Gemma, and also the fact that we're having this conversation as part of the DBA. It's quite timely, and I think it's quite fitting. There's so many things that runs across my mind just listening to everything we've all discussed. It's so fascinating. I think the first thing is just I probably agree with Colin. It's always very interesting looking at positionality and relationality, which is a very self-involved exercise. I often wonder, similar to what Colin has mentioned about academia, if at some point relationality and positionality will undertake an institutional level or departmental level. It's always the person. We have I don't know if we'll get to a point where the institution has to question itself. Because that point that Colin made about institutional incentivization, I think is the hidden demon in these things, because it incentivizes in a way the operationalization of neglecting relationality and positionality, which of course feeds into these very difficult conversations about, oh, that academic is going to put their name on the front, and, so that person is bad. But the system that necessitates that, to me, is sort of like what needs to question itself. And I suppose that's the long dream, so to speak. But to my question, I wonder if all of you panelists could share particular experiences in which your positionality and relationality was perceived as a threat. I mean, feel free to not answer that question if you want, but in a way in which it was explicitly told to you that it was a threat, it is a problem, you need to do away with it. And the reason why I ask is because I've faced similar instances and I get very dumbfounded by how do I navigate. So I guess what I'm asking is, could you share how you navigated those experiences? What are some of the tips that we can take on board to learn from as well? Because we're sort of dripping. I think it's more precise in the sense that Pacific relationality and positionality is something that drips out of every Pacific Islander, but in many spaces we get told, otherwise. So the last part to that is, I hope this becomes a book, that what you guys have started should be part of a book, because I feel that, especially in this big world of Australia, nothing is ever perceived as real, tacit knowledge or formal knowledge or whatever kind of knowledge, until you put it on paper. And I really hope these experiences that you have will be put on paper so that it can last forever and keep telling people who don't believe us. But anyway, the question is, how did you navigate it if you come across it? Can you help us, the rest of us?
I think the Gemma and Judy, that's probably wonderful to hear. You think it should be a book, because I think they see this as the start of a writing process. And thank you for also raising, I guess, that big question around, what is this self-reflexivity, positionality we can do for the broader structures of power within an institution, and that's something we should probably come back to. But your question is a very good one, and I think we heard, attention, Akka, when you were talking as well, around being asked to justify yourself. If anyone in the online audience wants to contribute, please do. I'm sorry you can't speak, but please do put your thoughts in the chat so that the panel can engage with them and you can engage with them in an ongoing process. But maybe I'll ask the panel and then see if anyone else wants to share their experiences.
Can I go to this one? I mean, reflecting on positionality and relationality, I mean, there is a self-focus, particularly through the PhD process, but it shouldn't be, really. I mean, we're all doing it in various ways, aren't we, in the way we navigate the world. And in terms of that then becoming more an institutional practice, I think there are examples of where it's been done better than, and I don't think I would hold ANU as my gold standard. So I to look at that question of institutional reflection is really important, but and having these kinds of forums are very much a key part of that, as the department should be doing as well, as we well know. In relation to your question around where we may have encountered threats or resistance, my experience over the years has largely been around representatives, statutory power, where there is extreme resistance, defensiveness, outright refusal. Because so much of the work that I've done over the years has been involved with working with victims of crime, people in prison, and so on and so forth. So it's an opportunity to look at the practices and the ways people, their perceptions and experiences of being in that incredibly marginalised or disempowered power position. So it's not necessarily going to lend itself to support from institutions. So how you overcome that is, to my mind, often about having to look at other ways around some of those barriers, to do the research in a different way. Sometimes you have to modify how you're going to do it, and accept that you cannot often collaborate well when you do research, either with the people in power and the people not in power. There are limitations. Or if the research I did not long ago with women who'd come out of jail here in Canberra, the interactions that were had were of very limited nature, and they all came from very different backgrounds, I think it's fair to say. And it wasn't a community except in the sense that they shared the prison experience, and all of them had drug dependency issues and often mental health issues. So it's not that you can collaborate in a truly deeply engaged way that I would assume, all aspire to. You have to accept some of those limitations around that are created in the scope of what you're trying to achieve. And think more pragmatically, quite frankly, I think, around the benefits to those involved in the research and how you can sidestep some of those people who don't want you to be doing it in the first place. But that is meant to be the advantage, coming back to maybe looking at what academia can offer, an opportunity to make known things that would be difficult for people on the inside to do, is the underlying sort of tenet of some of the research that has gone on across the board everywhere. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Gemma. Were you going to say something then? I'll pass over to you.
Thank you so much, Joppe, for that question. And I think in terms of responding to that, I wasn't necessarily confronted explicitly with the threat to my positionality, but I do remember, as we reflect, questioning of the self. And this kind of ties in with an online question posed by, I think, Arama Taire. Apologies if I've pronounced your name incorrectly, where she asks, how do us as diasporic Pacific researchers navigate our own internal dichotomies of authentic or inauthentic as researchers, but also the dichotomic authentic or inauthentic voices of our people. And so it made me think about some of the labeling or the bullying that could occur between scholars or colleagues, whether that be by Pacific scholars, or whether that be by non-Pacific scholars, or people who are doing HDR. And so when I think about that, this issue that I had was in relation to whether or not you're Pacific enough, or Tongan enough, or Indigenous enough to carry out a certain research with Indigenous communities, or with Pacific communities, or with your community, right? And are you Tongan enough, or are you Fijian enough to use those really important Indigenous methodology or methodological approaches to inform your research? And I think that particular question is not very useful, because we ourselves internalize colonization when we ask ourselves if we are Tongan enough or Indigenous enough. And it's that labeling that can sometimes skew the essence of who we are, particularly if we allow that to influence how we view ourselves, and therefore how it informs our research. And I think that it can inform a missed opportunity for some people who might not necessarily know their culture, but a missed opportunity to really learn about their culture and language, particularly if you've grown up within the diaspora. But one thing that I'm comforted in knowing as a Tongan is that, or as any other Pacific person who might share the same perspective as I, is, from the moment that we take our first breath as a Pacific person, we know we belong. And so on the identity continuum, where labels like, die-hard traditional or contemporary plastic, where it sits on the other end of the spectrum, we live in changing seasons of our lives, which allows us to move up and down this imaginary scale. But I've learned that irrespective of where you are and the environment that you find yourself in, I'm comforted in knowing that no one can take my identity or my Tonganness from me. And I don't know if that's helpful for you, Jope, in terms of whether or not you felt that your positionality was threatened as a Italke Fijian, or I don't know how you identify yourself with. But sometimes when we get asked certain questions, I think it's a disservice to ourselves to allow that to really speak to who we are, because it isn't. That's what I wanted to say.
Perhaps I'll just move to a question that's here, if that's okay. I guess we've sort of heard, and I think the experience that senior people have with these processes or practices is to almost it's starting from a justification perspective, and whether that's combative, like why are you doing this? Who is this for? Are you the right person to do? You have to justify, and whether that's a useful process or whether it can be combative and actually hard. But how it can move into a much more reflective space around our own worldviews, our own ways of being, and how they are shaping our research, and how important it is to discuss. We have a question here, which I think for many of the non-Pacific researchers might hit a chord from a research. And thank you for being vulnerable in asking the question. Saying someone who's lived and worked in the Pacific for a long time, whose ancestors were Pacific colonists even, wants to contribute, but is increasingly feeling unworthy of doing the work, not being Pacific Islander. And ask the question, does the panel have any advice for that researcher, or I guess generally for this, we don't want to leave it the elephant in the room, but who gets to tell these stories is part of the reason why I guess this work has come about. It's about unpacking power structures, looking at who's been representing who. So I guess for all the panel, what do you say to this specific researcher, but for other non-Pacific researchers who are going through these processes of trying to justify and understand their contributions?
I'll be very brief, but I think I have no tension points when it comes to who can tell the stories for whom. I started off thinking very possessive, and I guess I respond also to the question that Chopi raised about the threats that I confront. And these are the threats of my ownership of my space. When somebody else tells or writes a story about Kiribati, I get really agitated. Why are they writing about it? Are they Kiribati enough? You know, that sort of question that Gemma raised. But to be honest, I think it's the passion. Anyone with the right mind, the right passion to pursue a subject should not feel that they're constrained to tell that or pursue that story. And that's for me the best way to address it. I guess I stress a lot about positionality because it's the struggle that I find myself in terms of making sure that my research is not undermined by getting too close to my contact. But I always remind myself, and Chopi, you asked the question, what approach, how do you would navigate? For me, it's as simple as putting it in a way that, I cannot step out of my skin as an Kiribati person. This is who I am. I have to face this. And so in the same way, I guess anyone who feels the urge to tell that story, you don't have to be Kiribati enough, Pacific Islander enough to have the right to speak for others. I guess it's the passion to do so that matters.
I'll just say something quickly because I do have to go. Yeah, and I think this is why collaboration is really important and central to any kind of research endeavour. And what kind of stories people want to tell and represent. I would in no way be telling stories related to, say, sense of land or the ocean Kiribati. That is not something I would do. However, the area that I would be interested in is more to do with the institution that come out of a Western tradition justice system, for example. So that has tended to be the focus of my research. But also we're asking questions as poses a risk to someone who is of that place. So sometimes it can be advantageous to not be of that place in terms of the questions you're asking. And the fourth thing, and this is me maybe sounding a bit defensive about being a white person of privilege, but, and I know I'm seen that way, it's not just that I am, but it's how I'm seen as well. The other thing is I see myself as a money launderer. I can access money that people, particularly in Papua New Guinea where I do research, can't access. So it's a way to get money, not money laundering, but money transfer.
It's your first.
You have any comments or objections on that point?
Something that I've been thinking of, and this isn't just at an individual level, but this happens at an institutional level as well. Some of the stuff in trying to justify engagements, as kind of outsider bodies, agents, trying to justify engagements with the Pacific. There's been this real approach recently as kind of Indigenousness has become really sexy to pick up on things like custodianship or stewardship or talanoa to appropriate things. And because we try and lean into justifying ourselves, sometimes we lean way too far into that and then start appropriating. And that is really dangerous. I think it's something that a lot of people institutions make mistakes with, especially in the early days. And it's kind of really picked up now as this thing that's just accepted. I look at my work, a lot of it's looking at kind of development agents in the ocean space and the amount of times that people are talking about Apelli Hawaiifa and our Sea Islands, and there's no way in the world that they've read more than the final paragraph of that paper. Or they're drawing on all these different ideas that are just ridiculous, and you're thinking you're trying to justify yourself, and you've done that by picking up appropriation, and that's a really powerful tool to do that with. And I think we just need to be really careful about that.
Sounds like a good chapter for the book.
So if I could just add something very quickly, because we came out of a presentation earlier today, CRC Gavin's presentation, and he emphasized cultural competency. I think that's extremely important. And like us trying to navigate academia, the space of understanding when to become too close or not too close. In the same manner, we need to also navigate the space that we're entering the Pacific. If you're a non-Pacific Islander, and all these things that we discussed about cultural protocols. I mean, if you are cultural competent, you've lived in the Pacific, we tend to say, no, how Pacific are you before you run this story or do this project? But I guess for those who feel that they have that connection. It comes back to what I said earlier about value added. I guess you can ask yourself, how much value added can you bring? I haven't been to Fiji, so maybe there's no value added there. So, but if you feel that there's a connection, and that's relationality, right? And why not to pursue what you can do in the area? But yet they treat it with care, you know, treat with care in the spaces where you feel you shouldn't step up as a non-Pacific Islander.
Gemma, did you want to add anything to this discussion?
Yeah, sure. Just adding to what my colleagues have said. I think additionally important to cultural competency is cultural safety, where whether you're Pacific or non-Pacific, right? Irrespective of what ethnicity or what nationality one is. See you, Judy. It's really important that one is very aware of how their implicit biases or presumed assumptions or stereotypes that they might have of the world or of the group or of the communities that they're intending on working with is not going to affect, negatively impact their interaction with those peoples, but also in terms of how the way that data is collected or how the way it's interpreted and so forth and documented. And so being, you know, that's that self-checking in, which is what C.R.C. Gavitt had described reflexivities. He called it self-check-ins. And that's what's really important about, you know, being a researcher, being a good researcher is having that rigor of continual self-check-ins with the self and making sure that how the way I think won't impede the interactions that I have with these important communities that we're essentially informing our research and therefore our findings. So yeah, that's me, Malo.
All right, we might have come to a bit of an end, but I think we've got a useful way forward, which is what the organisers wanted, that ongoing conversation. So they did suggest that if anyone would like to remain sort of engaged in a bit of a community practice around this and possibly contribute to some writing, to please email Gemma and Judy was the suggestion, and that they would sort of continue to take this further. But listening to everything today, I think we've really covered a huge amount of ground. The abstract sort of asserted that this stuff is useful, you know, and I think we heard how it can help us reflect on our own biases, acknowledge that knowledge is not value neutral, uncovering power imbalances. You know, but we did also touch on some of the critiques, I guess. You know, the essentialising or oversimplifying us a bit. You know, the tokenism, sometimes people being a bit burdened to represent their group, and this bigger issue that doesn't necessarily really address some of those structural and systematic factors. So I think we've sort of heard the breadth of it, that it can be generative, painful, disheartening, useful, all of the above, and it will be a nice thing to think and write on more. So thank you all very much for being part of the conversation, and to everyone online, thank you for your comments and staying with us, for the ones that have stayed with us. And as I said, if you'd like to continue the conversation with the group, please get in touch with Gemma and Judy, who I assume are very easy to find online, for anyone online who's not part of DPA here. And thanks all for staying so long.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Gemma.
See ya.